Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue in our reading of Zane Gray's The Desert of Wheat, Chapter 19. "Come here, Kurt," he said, and then, putting Lenore before him, he moved a few steps aside, out of earshot of the shifty-footed harvest hands. "Say, you called the turn right off, didn't you?" "Anderson, I've had a hard experience, all in one harvest time," replied Dorn. "I'll bet you I can find out who threw this wrench into your harvester." "I don't doubt you, my lad, but how?" "It had to be thrown by one of these men near the machine. That harvester hasn't run 20 feet from where the trick was done. Let these men face me. I'll find the guilty one." "Wait till we get Lenore out of the way," replied Anderson. "Boss, me and Bill can answer for that outfit as it stands, and no risks for nobody," put in Jake coolly. Anderson's reply was cut short by a loud explosion. It frightened Lenore. She imagined one of the steam engines had blown up. "That thresher's on fire!" shouted Bourne, pointing toward a big machine that was attached by an endless driving belt to an engine. The workmen, uttering yells and exclamations, ran toward the scene of the new accident, leaving Anderson, his daughter, and the foreman behind. Smoke was pouring out of the big harvester. The harvest hands ran wildly around, shouting and calling, evidently unable to do anything. The line of wagons full of wheat sheaves broke up. Men dragged at the plunging horses. Then flame followed the smoke out of the thresher. "I've heard of threshers catching fire," said Anderson, as if dumbfounded, "but I never seen one. Now how on earth did that happen?" "Another trick, Anderson," replied Dorn. "Some IWW has stuffed a handful of matches into a wheat sheaf, or maybe a small bomb." "Uh-huh. Come on, let's go over and see my money burn up. Kurt, I'm getting some new education these days." Dorn appeared to be unable to restrain himself. He hurried on ahead of the others, and Anderson whispered to Lenore, "I'll bet something's coming off." This alarmed Lenore, yet it also thrilled her. The threshing machine burned like a house of cards. Farmhands came running from all over the field, but nothing manifestly could be done to save the thresher. Anderson, holding his daughter's arm, calmly watched it burn. There was excitement all around. It had not been communicated, however, to the rancher. He looked thoughtful. The foreman darted among the groups of watchers, and his distress was very plain. Dorn had gotten out of sight. Lenore still held his coat and wondered what he was doing. She was thoroughly angry and marveled at her father's composure. The big thresher was reduced to a blazing, smoking hulk in short order. Dorn came striding up. His face was pale and his mouth set. "Mr. Anderson, you've got to make a strong stand, and quick," he said deliberately. "I reckon, and I'm ready if it's the right time," replied the rancher. "But what can we prove?" "That's proof," declared Dorn, pointing at the ruined thresher. "Do you know all your honest hands?" "Yes, and I've got enough to clean up this outfit in no time. We're only waiting." "What for?" "Well, I reckon for what's just come off." "Don't let them go any farther. Look at these fellows. Can't you tell the IWWs from the others?" "No, I can't, unless I count all the new harvest hands as IWWs." "Everyone you don't know here is in with that gang," declared Dorn, and he waved a swift hand at the groups. His eyes swept piercingly over, and apparently through the men nearest at hand. At this juncture, Jake and Bill, with two other cowboys, strode up to Anderson. "Another accident, boss," said Jake sarcastically. "Ain't it about time we corralled some of this outfit?" Anderson did not reply. He had suddenly imitated Lenore, who had become solely bent upon Dorn's look. That indeed was cause for interest. It was directed at a member of the nearest group, a man in rough garb with slouch hat pulled over his eyes. As Lenore looked, she saw the man, suddenly become more aware of Dorn's scrutiny, hastily turn and walk away. "Hold on," called Dorn, his voice ringing a command. It halted every moving person on that part of the field. Then Dorn actually bounded across the intervening space. "Come on, boys," said Anderson. "Get in this. Dorn spotted someone, and now that's all we want. Lenore, stick close behind me. Jake, you keep near her." They moved hastily to back up Dorn, who had already reached the workman. He halted. Anderson took out a whistle and blew such a shrill blast that it deafened Lenore and must have been heard all over the harvest field. Not improbably, that was a signal agreed upon between Anderson and his men. Lenore gathered that all had been in readiness for a concerted movement and that her father believed Dorn's actions had brought the climax. "Haven't I seen you before?" queried Dorn sharply. The man shook his head and kept it bent a little, and then he began to edge back nearer to the stragglers, who slowly closed into a group behind him. He seemed nervous, shifty. He can't speak English," spoke up one of them gruffly. Dorn looked aggressive and stern. Suddenly his hand flashed out to snatch off the slouch hat which hid the fellow's face. Amazingly, a gray wig came with it. This man was not old. He had fair, thick hair. For a moment, Dorn gazed at the slouch hat and wig. Then, with a fierce action, he threw them down and swept a clutching hand for the man. The fellow dodged, and, straightening up, he reached for a gun. But Dorn lunged upon him. Then followed a hard grappling sound and a hoarse yell. Something bright glinted in the sun. It made a sweeping circle, belched fire and smoke. The report stunned Lenore. She shut her eyes and clung to her father. She heard cries, a scuffling, sodden blows. "Jake, Bill," called Anderson. "Hold on, no gunplay yet. Dorn's making hash out of that fellow. Watch the other sharp." Then Lenore looked again. Dorn had twisted the man around and was in the act of stripping off the further disguise of beard, disclosing the pale and convulsed face of a comparatively young man. "Glidden!" burst out Dorn. His voice had a terrible ring of furious amaze. His whole body seemed to gather as in a knot and then to spring. The man called Glidden went down before that onslaught, and his gun went flying aside. 3 of Glidden's group started for it. The cowboy Bill leaped forward, a gun in each hand. "Yar! Back!" he yelled. And then all except the 2 struggling principals grew rigid. Lenore's heart was burning in her throat. The movements of Dorn were too swift for her sight. But Glidden she saw handled as if by a giant. Up and down he was thrown with bloody face, swinging arms, while he uttered hoarse bawls. Dorn's form grew more distinct. It plunged and swung in frenzied energy. Lenore heard men running and yells from all around. Her father spread wide his arm before her so that she had to bend low to see. He shouted a warning. Jake was holding a gun thrust forward. "Boss, he's gonna kill Glidden," said the cowboy in a low tone. Anderson's reply was incoherent, but its meaning was plain. Lenore's lips and tongue almost denied her utterance. "Oh, don't let him!" The crowd behind the wrestling couple swayed back and forth, and men changed places here and there. Bill strode across the space, guns leveled. Evidently this action was due to the threatening movements of several workmen who crouched, as if to leap on Dorn as he whirled in his fight with Glidden. "Well, it's about time," yelled Anderson, as a number of lean, rangy men, rushing from behind, reached Bill's side, there to present an armed and threatening front. All eyes now centered on Dorn and Glidden. Lenore, seeing clearly for the first time, suffered a strange, hot paroxysm of emotion, never before experienced by her. It left her weak. She seemed to stultify the cry that had been trying to escape her. She wanted to scream that Dorn must not kill the man. Yet there was a ferocity in her that froze the cry. Glidden's coat and blouse were half torn off, blood covered him. He strained and flung himself weakly in that iron clutch. He was beaten and bent back. His tongue hung out, bloody, fluttering with strangled cries, a ghastly face appalling in its fear of death. Lenore broke her mute spell of mingled horror and passion. "For God's sake, don't let Dorn kill him," she implored. "Why not?" muttered Anderson. "That's Glidden. He killed Dorn's father, burned his wheat, ruined him." "Dad, for my sake," she cried brokenly. "Jake, stop him," yelled Anderson. "Pull him off." As Lenore saw it, with eyes again half failing her, Jake could not separate Dorn from his victim. "Let go, Dorn," he yelled. "You're cheating the gallows. Hey, Bill, he's a bull. Help me are quick." Lenore did not see the resulting conflict, but she could tell by something that swayed the crowd when Glidden had been freed. "Hold up this outfit," yelled Anderson to his men. "Come on, Jake, drag him along." Jake appeared, leading the disheveled and wild-eyed Dorn. "Son, you did my heart good, but there was some around here who didn't want you to spill blood, and that's well, for I am seeing red, Jake. You take Dorn and Lenore a piece toward the house, then hurry back." Then Lenore felt that she had hold of Dorn's arm, and she was listening to Jake without understanding a word he said, while she did hear Father's yell of command. "Line up there, you IWWs." Jake walked so swiftly that Lenore had to run to keep up. Dorn stumbled. He spoke incoherently. He tried to stop. At this, Lenore clasped his arm and cried, "Oh, Kurt, come home with me." They hurried down the slope. Lenore kept looking back. The crowd appeared bunched now with little motion. That relieved her. There was no more fighting. Presently, Dorn appeared to go more willingly. He had relaxed. Let go, Jake," he said. I'm all right now. That arm hurts." "Well, you'll excuse me, Dorn, for handling you rough. Maybe you don't remember punching me one when I got between you and Glidden." "Did I? I couldn't see, Jake," said Dorn. His voice was weak and had a spent ring of passion in it. He did not look at Lenore, but kept his face turned toward the cowboy. "I reckon this is fur enough," rejoined Jake, halting and looking back. "No one coming, and there'll be hell to pay out there. You go into that house with Miss Lenore, will you?" "Yes," replied Dorn. "Rustle along then, and you, Miss Lenore, don't you worry none about us." Lenore nodded, and holding Dorn's arm closely, she walked as fast as she could down the lane. I kept your coat," she said, "though I never thought of it till just now." She was trembling all over, hot and cold by turns, afraid to look up at him, yet immensely proud of him with a strange, sickening dread. He walked rather dejectedly now, or else bent somewhat from weakness. She stole a quick glance at his face. It was white as a sheet. Suddenly she felt something wet and warm trickle from his arm down into her hand. Blood. She shuddered, but did not lose her hold. After a faintish instant, there came a change in her. Are you hurt?" she asked. I guess not. I don't know," he said. "But the blood," she faltered. He held up his hands. His knuckles were bloody, and it was impossible to tell whether from injury to them or not. But his left forearm was badly cut. "The gun cut me, and he bit me too," said Dorn. "I'm sorry you were there. What a beastly spectacle for you." "Never mind me," she murmured. "I'm all right now. But oh," she broke off eloquently. "Was it you who had the cowboys pull me off him?" Jake said as he broke me loose, "for Miss Lenore's sake." "It was Dad who sent them, but I begged him to." Now that was Glidden, the IWW agitator and German agent. He just the same as murdered my father. He burned my wheat, lost my all. "Yes, I know, Kurt. whispered Lenore. I meant to kill him. That was easy to tell. Oh, thank God you did not. Come, don't let us stop. She could not face the piercing, gloomy eyes that went through her. Well, why should you care? Someone will have to kill Glidden. Oh, do not talk so, she implored. Surely now you're glad you did not. I don't understand myself. I'm certainly sorry you were there. There's a beast in men, in me. I had a gun in my pocket. But do you think I'd have used it? I wanted to feel his flesh tear, his bones break, his blood spurt. Kurt! Yes, well, that was the Hun in me, he declared, in sudden bitter passion. Oh, my friend, do not talk so, she cried. You make me... Oh, there is no Hun in you. Yes, that is what ails me. There is not, she flashed back, roused to passion. You had been made desperate. You acted as any wrong man. You fought. He tried to kill you. I saw the gun. No one could blame you. I had my own reason for begging to add to keep you from killing him, a selfish woman's reason. But I tell you, I was so furious, so wrought up, that if it had been any man but you, he should have killed him. Lenore, you're beyond my understanding, replied Dorn with emotion. But I thank you for excusing me, for standing up for me. It was nothing. Oh, how you bleed. Doesn't that hurt? I have no pain, no feeling at all, except a sort of dying down in me of what must have been hell. They reached the house and went in. No one was there, which fact relieved Lenore. I'm so glad Mother and the girls won't see you, she said hurriedly. Go up to your room. I'll bring bandages. He complied without any comment. Lenore searched for what she needed to treat a wound and ran upstairs. Dorn was sitting on a chair in his room, holding his arm from which blood dripped to the floor. He smiled at her. You would be a pretty Red Cross nurse, he said. Lenore placed a bowl of water on the floor and, kneeling beside Dorn, took his arm and began to bathe it. He winced. The blood covered her fingers. My blood on your hands, he exclaimed morbidly. German blood. Kurt, you're out of your head, retorted Lenore hotly. If you dare say that again, I'll... She broke off. What will you do? Lenore faltered. What would she do? A revelation must come sooner or later, and the strain had begun to wear upon her. She was stirred to her depths, and instincts were there leaping. No sweet, gentle, kindly sympathy would avail with this tragic youth. He must be carried by storm. Something in the violence he had shown with Glidden seemed necessary to make him forget himself. All his whole soul must be set in one direction. He could not see that she loved him when she had looked it, acted it, almost spoken it. His blindness was not to be endured. Kurt Dorn, don't dare to say that again. She ceased bathing his arm and looked up at him, suddenly quite pale. I apologize. I'm only bitter, he said. Don't mind what I say. It's so good of you to do this. Then in silence Lenore dressed his wound, and if her heart did beat unwontedly, her fingers were steady and deft. He thanked her with moody eyes, seeing far beyond her. When I lie over there with... If you go, she interrupted. He was indeed hopeless. I advise you to rest a little. I'd like to know what becomes of Glidden, he said. Well, so should I. That worries me. Weren't there a lot of cowboys with guns? There's so many that there's no need for you to go out and start another fight. I did start it, didn't I? You surely did. She left him then, turning in the doorway to ask him please to be quiet and let the day go by without seeking those excited men again. He smiled, but he did not promise. For Lenore, the time dragged between dread and suspense. From her window she saw a motley crowd pass down the lane to the main road. No harvesters were working. At the noon meal, only her mother and the girls were present. Word had come that the IWW men were being driven from many waters. Mrs. Anderson worried, and Lenore's sisters, for once, were all quiet. All afternoon the house was lifeless. No one came or left. Lenore listened to every little sound. It relieved her that Dorn had remained in his room. Her hope was that the threatened trouble had been averted, but something told her that the worst was yet to come. It was nearly supper time when she heard the men returning. They came in a body, noisy and loitering, as if reluctant to break away from one another. She heard the horses tramp into the barns and the loud voices of drivers. When she went downstairs, she encountered her father. He looked impressive, triumphant. His effort at evasion did not deceive Lenore, but she realized at once that in this instance she could not get any news from him. He said everything was all right and that the IWW men were to be deported from Washington. But he did not want any supper, and he had a low-voiced, significant interview with Dorn. Lenore longed to know what was pending. Dorn's voice, when he said at his door, "Anderson, I'll go," was ringing hard and deadly. It frightened Lenore. Go where? What were they going to do? Lenore thought of the vigilantes her father had organized. Supper time was an ordeal. Dorn ate a little, and excusing himself, he went back to his room. Lenore got through the meal somehow, and going outside, she encountered Jake. The moment she questioned him, she knew something extraordinary had taken place or was about to take place. She coaxed and entreated. For once, Jake was hard to manage. But the more excuses he made, the more he evaded her, the greater became Lenore's need to know. And at last she wore the cowboy out. He could not resist her tears, which began to flow in spite of her. See here, Miss Lenore, I reckon you care a heap for young Dorn, begging your pardon," queried Jake. "Care for him? Jake, I love him." "And then take a hunch from me and keep him home, with you, tonight." "Does Father want Kurt Dorn to go, wherever he's going?" "Why, I should smile. Your dad likes the way Dorn handles IWWs," replied Jake significantly. "Vigilantes," whispered Lenore. Chapter 20. Lenore waited for Kurt and stood half concealed behind the curtains. It had dawned upon her that she had an ordeal at hand. Her heart palpitated. She heard his quick step on the stairs. She called before she showed herself. "Hello, but you startled me," he exclaimed. He had been surprised, too, at the abrupt meeting. Certainly he had not been thinking of her. His pale, determined face attested to stern and excitable thought. He halted before her. "Where are you going?" asked Lenore. "To see your father." "What about?" "It's rather important," he replied with hesitation. "Will it take long?" He showed embarrassment. We'll be occupied most all evening." "Indeed. Very well. If you'd rather be occupied than spend the evening with me." Lenore turned away, affecting a disdainful heart and hurt manner. "Lenore, it's not that," he burst out. "I'd rather spend an evening with you than anybody else or do anything." "Well, that's very easy to say, Mr. Dorn," she returned lightly. "But it's true," he protested. "Come out of the hall. Father will hear us," she said, and then led him into the room. It was not so light in here and there, but what light there was fell upon his face and left hers in shadow. I've made an appointment for tonight," he declared with difficulty. "Can't you break it?" she asked. "No, that would leave me open to cowardice, perhaps your father's displeasure." "Kurt Dorn, it's brave to give up some things, and if you go, you'll incur my displeasure." "Go!" he ejaculated, staring at her. "Oh, I know, and I'm, well, not flattered to see you'd rather go hang IWWs than stay here with me." Lenore did not feel the assurance and composure with which she spoke. She was struggling with her own feelings. She believed that just as soon as she and Kurt understood each other, faced each other without any dissimulation, then she would feel free and strong. If only she could put the situation on a sincere footing. She must work for that. Her difficulty was with a sense of falsity. There was no time to plan. She must change his mind. Her words had made him start. Then you know? Of course. I'm sorry for that, he replied soberly as he brushed a hand up through his wet hair. But will you stay home? No, he returned shortly, and he looked hard. Kurt, I don't want you mixed up with any lynching bees, she said earnestly. I'm a citizen of Washington. I'll join the vigilantes. I'm American. I've been ruined by these IWWs. No man in the West has lost so much. Father, home, land, my greatest harvest of wheat. Why shouldn't I go? There's no reason except me, she replied, rather unsteadily. He drew himself up with a deep breath as if fortifying himself. Now that's a mighty good reason. But you will be kinder if you withdraw your objections. Can't you conceive of any reason why I beg you not to go? I can't, he replied, staring at her. It seemed that every moment he spent in her presence increased her effect upon him. Lenore felt this, and that buoyed up her failing courage. Kurt, you've made a very distressing and terrible and horrible blunder, she said with a desperation that must have seemed something else to him. My heavens, what have I done? He gasped, his face growing paler. How ready he was to see the more catastrophe. It warmed her heart and strengthened her nerve. The moment had come. Even if she did lose her power of speech, she still could show him what his blunder was. Never in all her life had ever been 100th part as hard as this. Yet as the words formed, her whole heart seemed to be behind them, forcing them out. If only he did not misunderstand. Then she looked directly at him and tried to speak. Her first attempt was inarticulate. Her second was a whisper. Didn't you ever think I might care for you? It was as if a shock went over him, leaving him trembling. But he did not look as amazed as incredulous. No, I certainly never did, he said. Well, that's your blunder, for I do. You never asked me. You do what? Care for me? What on earth do you mean by that? Lenore was fighting many emotions now, the one most poignant being a wild desire to escape, which battled with an equally maddening one to hide her face on his breast. Yet she could see how white he had grown, how different. His hands worked convulsively and his eyes pierced her very soul. What should a girl mean, telling she cared? I don't know. Girls are beyond me, he replied stubbornly. Indeed, that's true. I've felt so far beyond you. I had to come to this. Lenore, he burst out hoarsely, you talk in riddles. You've been so strange, yet so fine, so sweet. And now you say you care for me. Care? What does that mean? A word can drive me mad. But I never dared to hope. I love you, love you, love you. My word, you're all I've left to love. Do you think you've a monopoly on all the love in the world? Interrupted Lenore, coming to her real self. His impassioned declaration was all she needed. Her ordeal was over. It seemed as if he could not believe his ears or eyes. Monopoly? World? He echoed. Of course I don't. But, Kurt, I love you just as much as you love me. So there. Lenore had time for one look at his face before he enveloped her. What a relief to hide her own. It was pressed to his breast very closely. Her eyes shut, and she felt hot tears under the lids. All before her darkened sight seemed confusion, whirling chaos. It seemed that she could not breathe, and strangely did not need to. How unutterably happy she felt. That was an age-long moment, wonderful for her own relief and gladness, full of changing emotions. Presently, Kurt appeared to be coming to some semblance of rationality. He released her from that crushing embrace, but still kept an arm around her while he held her off and looked at her. Lenore, will you kiss me? He whispered. She could have cried out in sheer delight at the wonder of that whisper in her ear. It had been she who had changed the world for Kurt Dorn. Yes, presently, she replied with a tremulous little laugh. Wait till I get my breath. I was beside myself, am so yet, he replied, low-voiced as if in awe. I've been lifted to heaven. It cannot be true. I believe, yet I'll not be sure till you kiss me. You, Lenore Anderson, this girl of my dreams. Do you love me? Is it true? Yes, Kurt, indeed I do, very dearly, she replied, and turned to look up into his face. It was transfigured. Lenore's heart swelled as a deep and profound emotion waved over her. Please kiss me then. She lifted her face, flushing scarlet. Their lips met. Then, with her head upon his shoulder and her hands closely held, she answered the 1,001 questions of the bewildered and exalted lover who could not realize the truth. Lenore laughed at him and eloquently furnished proof of her own obsession, and told him how and why and when it all came about. Not for hours did Kurt come back to actualities. I forgot about vigilantes, he exclaimed suddenly. It's too late now. Oh, how the time has flown. Lenore thought of other things, breaks in, alas. He kissed her hand and got up. Another change was coming over him. Lenore had long expected the moment when realization would claim his attention. She was prepared. Yes, you forgot your appointment with Dad and the vigilantes. You've missed some excitement and violence. His face had grown white again, grave now and troubled. May I speak to your father? He asked. Yes, she replied. If I come back from the war, well, not crippled, will you promise to marry me? Kurt, I promise now. That seemed to shake him. But Lenore, it's not fair to you. I don't believe a soldier should bind a girl by marriage or engagement before he goes to war. She should be free. I want you to be free. That's for you to say, she replied softly. But for my part, I don't want to be free if you go away to war. If I'm going, he said with a start. You don't want to be free? Lenore, would you be engaged to me? My dear boy, of course I would. It seems I am, doesn't it? She replied with one of her deep, low laughs. He gazed at her, fascinated, worked upon by overwhelming emotions. Would you marry me before I go? Yes, she flashed. He bent and bowed then under the storm. Stumbling to her almost on his knees, he brokenly expressed his gratitude, his wonder, his passion, and the terrible temptation that he must resist, which she must help him to resist. Kurt, I love you. I will see things through your eyes if I must. I want to be a comfort to you, not a source of sorrow.